This is Father Gregory Pine.
This is Father Joseph Anthony Kress.
And welcome to Godsplaining. Thanks to all those who support us. Sincerely, thanks. If you enjoy the show, please consider making a monthly donation on Patreon. Be sure to like and subscribe to Godsplaining wherever you listen to your podcasts. For this episode of Guestsplaining, we are pumped and delighted to have with us Father Patrick Riffle. Thanks for joining the show.
Cheers.
So I don't know that many of our listeners will know you unless our listeners went to Mass at St. Peter's Catholic Church on Capitol Hill for a time, or were in seminary formation with you, or live in Jacksonville, North Carolina. But for those who don't know you, would you say a word of introduction, who you are, where you're from, what you do?
Sure thing. So Father Patrick Riffle, originally I'm a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington, D.C., so that's the connection there to St. Peter's on Capitol Hill. But currently serving as a chaplain in the United States Navy and stationed now at Marine Corps Base Camp Lejeune in North Carolina.
Nice.
Yeah.
So your name came up recently because we had a men's retreat in Brevard, North Carolina. We actually just had two of the three men who run that camp on a Guestsplaining episode. That's Adam and Jeffrey Truffant. But the name of the retreat was Soldiers and Martyrs. We just picked it because we wanted to talk about the virtue of courage, and those would be your two prime examples of the virtue of courage, soldiers and martyrs. And little did we know that when you advertise something with the word soldiers in the title, soldiers and sailors show up. So within like the first 20 minutes of the retreat, it became evident that there were like 7 servicemen there. They were looking around like, hey, can you do terrible things with your hands and with instruments? And they're like, yeah, I could see that about, so it was pretty sweet. And as a result of which, the retreat was especially intense, but like very focused. And many of the men attributed their kind of spiritual formation, and some of them, their return to the faith, to your ministration specifically. So it's for that reason that we're following up. But I thought maybe just as a way to start off, could you talk a little bit about like what it means to be a priest in the Navy? Sometimes people be like, oh, I'm wearing hats and I got different hats, but I mean, there's a hierarchical order whenever you have different things going on. But what's it like in your specific context?
Sure. Yeah, no, being in the military, there's definitely lots of hats that we're changing around from time to time. But so what we do is we provide, as part of the Archdiocese for the military services, we provide for the Catholic ministry, administration of the sacraments, and pastoral care to those Catholics that are serving, in my case, in the United States Navy, the United States Marine Corps, and the United States Coast Guard. So we take care of all of the sea services. And really the best way I would describe it is being a missionary. We are working with a population. Not only do we take care of the Catholics that are part of our individual units or bases that we're assigned to, but really whoever walks through the door. And so we really do, in a very secular organization, which is the Navy, the military, we get to be that presence of Christ, to be that one who brings the truth of the gospel, the sacramental life of the church into the midst of that organization, particularly to the majority of our population, which is between the ages of 18 and 25 years old. So as a diocesan priest, we really don't think of being a missionary and being diocesan. You think of more of the parochial type ministry. But as a Navy chaplain, my work is absolutely missionary based.
Yeah, I think when people imagine a soldier or a sailor, they think of like a 35 to 37-year-old man with like, a tight haircut and no beard, currently at present, with like a knife between his teeth, kind of like muscle bound and bulging out of his shirt. But as it turns out, like the average age, I imagine, on an aircraft carrier is probably like 18 years old and 6 months. It's just a lot of what we might call youth ministry or young adult ministry. So what's it like? You mean you're dealing with things that are deadly serious on the one hand,
Sure.
like life and death and the defense of our country. And then on the other hand, you've got young people, just like very young people. Oftentimes, they don't necessarily have a great formation from back at home or from school. And in part, they might be avoiding that formation back at home, back at school. So, yeah, what's it like to be in that contrast?
So I think, you hit it right there, Father, with that that in age bracket, you mentioned aircraft carrier. My first tour was on an aircraft carrier. I was on the USS Nimitz, and got the opportunity to deploy with her. And you would stand there on the flight deck of this massive ship in the middle of the ocean. You look out there, and who's out there landing those planes, launching those planes, moving the things around? 18, 19-year-olds who are making that happen every single day. And I mean, it's crazy, right? When you think about it. And it's amazing to watch that work. The same is true in working with the Marines. You know, you work with your standard military or Marine Corps unit, and 18 to 20-year-olds, that's who makes up the bulk of those who are deploying on our ships, moving out to the front lines to defend our nation. And so you're right. It's a unique age demographic that we're working with in that regard. But that faith formation piece too, we are such a cross sampling of America. We're pulling from every corner of the United States, bringing people in, and then having the opportunity to work with them. And a lot of them do come with some faith background. And then there's others who are just, now that they're on their own, they don't have that support that they had back home. It becomes a period of time in which they are really beginning to discover themselves and trying to learn. They're given this awesome responsibility to be very adult, but they're trying to grow themselves. And part of that is growing in the faith. They're hungry for it. And some seek for it in other ways that are probably not beneficial to themselves and to their souls. But then there are some who dig a little bit deeper and start pursuing the things of God. And that's where we come in. And it's a really beautiful opportunity to capitalize on that.
So I'm wondering about, there seems to be a kind of shift in parenting in the last 40 years. Father Patrick will sometimes quote his friend Austin Quick, and he'll say, we went from latchkey kids to helicopter parents, and now you've got what he calls Zamboni parents. So not only do they hover over their kids, but they smooth the way for their kids in anticipation of whatever difficulty or trouble they might encounter in the world. And, many studies have observed that resiliency is on the decline, right? So you have the kind of mental health crisis in general, but then a kind of concentration in that amongst the impressionable young, who often, suffer from insecure attachments with respect to, parents and caretakers, but then also have just been traumatized by a combination of comparison, boredom, sensation, and pornography addiction.
Yeah.
And you're in a position where you're trying to help these guys root out vice and help them cultivate virtue. But also they just don't have the same kind of human formation that men might have had 40 years ago. So how do you, you're not responsible for them wholly and entirely, but how do you go about that? How do you give them responsibility and train them up into that responsibility?
Well, I think it starts with that initial conversation, so one of the unique things about being the chaplain, a lot of times we're assigned to a particular unit, right? So it doesn't matter what the faith background of that individual is. They're going to walk through that door. We have this confidentiality. We're the only people in the military that an individual could go and talk to, say whatever, and it doesn't leave the room. So man, that opens up the door for who can I go talk to? And then that's where it happens. It's in that initial conversation of being able to allow them to express what it is that they're working through or seeking or struggling with. And then that becomes the opportunity to bring in the light of the gospel. Even with someone who doesn't know what religion is, but to be able to begin to speak that truth of what is virtue and how can we become more authentically human? How can we really, and using our Catholic and Christian, how can I embrace the fullness of humanity that Christ is calling me to by allowing myself to be filled with that practice of virtue, whether that is, chastity, whether it is temperance, and we could go down the list. But it becomes that opportunity, and that's how it starts. It starts with that simple conversation of being present to them, being there, and using that very human encounter to bring them to the things of God and to the beauty of the truths revealed to us in Christ.
Father, you're kind of speaking on how like drawing the soldiers and sailors and Marines into the depths of the faith and bringing them to that encounter with Christ. Um, what about the reverse engineering of that? Like, how has the Catholic faith helped maybe the Marines or the sailors who are Catholic, the kind of principles that are almost second nature to us as Catholics, like the understanding of self-sacrifice and penance, has that made them better Marines? Has that made them better sailors because they're coming from a background of knowing, hey, this is part of, what it means to be a Christian is to lay down your life for another or to undergo penance and mortifications for the good of another. Like, how has the Catholic faith helped to actually make the Marines or the sailors better at what is asked of them by their own nation?
No, I think that's a good point, especially with that idea that, as Father said, that idea of resiliency, right? The military life can be, especially for your junior enlisted individual, their life is hard and difficult. They have no freedom. They're told where to go, where to be. It doesn't matter if it's pouring down rain outside. You're going to be outside in your tent, and you're gonna do this. And that can wear on someone if we don't have that sense of something bigger than ourselves, whether that is a sense of sacrifice or a sense of purpose and meaning in what we're doing. Then it just becomes, the drudgery of the experience. So I think for the Catholic man who is growing in that virtue, who's embodying the faith, it gives them a higher purpose. And I think if we know anything about that age demographic that I'm working with, it's asking that question of why, looking for that meaning and that purpose. And so, absolutely, I've had conversations with that as a Catholic Marine will say, I did offer this up. I offered up the fact that I was very cold and very wet all this past week, for family members, for friends, for others who had gone away from the faith. Just recently had a conversation along those lines this past week. But I think it's that resiliency. It builds them up. It gives them a purpose. In many ways, gets them out of their own head, and they begin to see the bigger picture.
So I'm interested in like the role that death plays or the proximity of death. I imagine that in the armed services, you have a lot of different motivations. Like certain people will say it's to, like escape poverty, but that's to sell it short, like because a lot of these men enter because they have very noble desires and because they actually care about the types of things, around which the Constitution was framed. But I also suspect that like being around big machines and shooting big guns is also part of the deal. Sure. And then I also think too, like these guys, I mean, they have to know going in that that death's a real possibility and that they're going to become very intimate with death. I remember reading a letter of General George Patton. It was after the end of the First World War, in which, he acquitted himself admirably, but did not cover himself in glory. And he writes like longingly for the next war so that he will have the opportunity in which to like attain to the honor which he knows is his, like predestined to be. It's like, wowza. So I think these guys know that death lies waiting in the wings. Like, how do you, as a Catholic chaplain, right? These guys they're suffering traumatic brain injuries when they fall off the back of a Humvee, and they're, in the shoot house, and they're just breathing in all kinds of nonsense, which might potentially give them cancer, and they're going to like bleed out their ears if they keep doing it for as long as they intend to keep doing it. It's like, how do you like invite them back into life? Not to say that they're necessarily drifting from it, but like, how do you pull them out of that deathscape? Because it seems so very real.
No, that's very true, right? Especially for those that have been in more difficult situations, who have seen combat, who have been in some, whether it be even just a training type exercise where they've become very aware of that. And I think that, there's two parts to that. One part of that is you have to get past the sense of the fact that they are immortal, there is a certain point that they tell themselves, and they take on this mindset that they are immortal, that nothing will ever touch them. Now, that's all a facade. They know that, but that's what they tell themselves that. So once you chip past that, and then they would become very, the moral injury, really, that is what we're talking about here. The moral injury that comes from that experience of not only their own mortality or experiencing death or injury, catastrophic injury with other people around them, it does leave a mark. And I think bringing them back is really bringing them back to the ideas really of our faith. When we talk about the resurrection, when we talk about eternal life, where we talk about the value in suffering in and of itself, those pieces I think help to do that. And working with some individuals, particularly with PTSD, that are struggling with a little PTSD or moral injury, that's a big part of it, is helping them to see past just the death itself, and looking for the life behind it, looking for that resurrection. I often will tell them, we can't have, Good Friday does not end in of itself. We're always moving towards the resurrection. And so helping them to see that. And then that also determines the way that they live their lives, right? That helps them to grow in that practice of virtue themselves, to avoid sin, to grow as men who are conformed and configured to Christ. That becomes part of that whole process as well.
Father, there's a huge risk when we talk about those who are in combat, those who are in, maybe even very highly clandestine missions, special
Sure.
forces or things like that. That there's a risk of kind of compartmentalizing one's life. These Marines and these sailors, like they have families, like they're raising kids, and they can't necessarily bring the combat home with them. And there's a lot of pressure to kind of leave it on base or leave it on deployment, and then when you get home to kind of switch gears, and that can be very difficult. And the risk to compartmentalize is always going to be there. So when you look at these men, like how can you, or how is it that when one experiences, even a trauma, or they're experiencing some very difficult realities, how are they able or to have an integrated life when things are very starkly different between home and work, if we want to call it that?
No, that's a real struggle, especially, I can say even that in myself, not that I've ever been in combat, but even coming back from a 6-month deployment, you're living in an aircraft carrier, floating around with 5,000 of your favorite people, for 6 months at a time, and all you really see is water. Then you come back to the hustle and bustle of everyday life. It's jarring. So if I experience that, how much more so is that for someone who's been in combat? And I think really the faith becomes a place for that, because what is the consistency or the continuity that they have in those experiences is that context of their faith. And that's why we exist. And frankly, there's only about 41 of us priests currently on active duty in the entire United States Navy, Marine Corps, and Coast Guard. That faith aspect of being able to have access to the sacraments, to be able to celebrate particularly the sacrament of penance, of reconciliation, confession, to be able to have the Eucharist, that becomes the kind of the thread, I think, that for the Catholic, sailor, Marine, soldier, that becomes the thread. And I think that becomes the opportunity to help them work past that compartmentalizing, because it's going to happen. Let's just be honest. It's a survival technique, really, a coping mechanism that happens. But I think the faith can become a place where, they can that feels like home. I was assigned to Parris Island, South Carolina, the famous Marine Corps boot camp. So down there for 2.5 years working with recruits, I heard 1,000 times I made the worst decision of my life, and it's like, you might have, but that's okay. We're gonna push forward. Um, but every Sunday I would have 1,800, 2,000 recruits for mass. Now, all of them Catholic? No. All of them, devoutly practicing the faith? No. But why were they there? It was that connection back to home, this very militarized experience that they were having when they came in and we celebrated Holy Mass. It was a touch back to their other selves, to who they really are. So I think the faith plays a big part in that.
So I want to switch gears just a little bit and just talk about your experience of, like priestly identity and mission. Because, yeah, when you cite the statistics about the archdiocese and the military and how very understaffed you are, undermanned you are, it's devastating on the one hand and kind of discouraging. But then again, like we're all outgunned, outmanned, outnumbered, outplanned, quote Hamilton. So it's no surprise. Like it's gonna come and find us in whatever context of life. But I think I'm thinking about my own life. Jesus Christ is the sole mediator of salvation. He doesn't need me. He's chosen to implicate me in his saving work because he thought I might like it. Now I've found there's a kind of temptation to interiorize that with a dread logic and be like, if not for ... then everything is going to be terrible. Like you can't talk to all these guys. You can't serve all these guys. Except in some kind of vague way. Like what do you do to not die under the expectations or under, I don't know, like the burden of priestly ministry?
No, I appreciate that, because it is a thing. It's an absolute thing. I'm, like I said, on the aircraft carrier, I was one priest, actually, not only just for the aircraft carrier, but for a total of 8 ships throughout the strike group, and I was the sole priest. So how do you do that? And it really comes back to the fundamentals of first of all, of having that priestly identity. All of us that come into the military have to do a minimum of 3 years of work in our home diocese or religious community to really begin to ground ourselves in that. And then secondly, it's making sure that you are faithful to not only the celebration of daily mass, but your personal and private prayer, your meditative prayer, communing with Christ, bringing those things, the exhaustion to him. It's staying close to Our Lady. For me personally, the rosary has been an anchor. I know I'm a sailor, pardon the pun, but it's been an anchor for me. I could be quietly sitting, being transported by helicopter from one ship to the other, and I can sit there and pray that rosary, and it keeps me grounded. Lastly, it's fraternity. And that's hard. That is hard for us when we are so spread throughout. But the presbyterate of the military archdiocese has been really great as far as keeping tabs on each other, checking in with each other. If there are more than one of us in an area, we are having dinner at least a couple of times a month. So keeping close to priest, and then priest friends back home. I talk to a priest of the Archdiocese of Washington at 2-3 times a week, just to have that sense of that connectedness. I work with a lot of Protestant chaplains, very nice people, but they don't get that priestly life, and they don't get that priestly vocation. So that's how we have to do it. And it's a marathon. It's a marathon, not a sprint, right? I have to keep telling myself that. And I'm a little bit of a type A in that, maybe a little bit sanguine, and I'm like, let's go. But really kind of praying and asking for the virtue really of prudence there, and being able to, what is it, Lord, that you're calling me to in this moment? What is it that you need me to do?
You brought up the need for fraternity in your own kind of priestly life, and very unique circumstances and a high demand, and how you have to intentionally kind of seek out that fraternity, but how valuable it is. I think that's maybe one of the most attractive things about young men who want to sign up for for armed services is that there's a fraternity there. The bonds that you share in foxholes are bonds forever. Yep. And can you speak to your experience of fraternity within the military and how necessary that is just for any individual? And we are experiencing in our society an extreme crisis of isolation, crisis of loneliness, and yet the military does have this kind of unique way of forging or maybe even imposing fraternity among its members. So can you speak to your experience of kind of military fraternity and how that has played into maybe kind of curtailing some of the loneliness?
Sure. Yeah. No, there definitely is the forced fun factor, that, as they call it in the military, that that is part of the day-to-day life. But the military itself, even though they make great bonds and great friendships with their fellow Marines and sailors they work with, the military is not immune from the loneliness and the isolation that our wider society is experiencing. But when they are able to come together and to experience that, it's amazing to watch how they flourish. And so one example of that really is one of the works that we've been able to do on my current assignment in Camp Lejeune at our Catholic chapel has been starting a men's group. And it's grown from in the last 9 months, from starting with 6 individuals, 6 junior enlisted, to upwards of about 40 who attend regularly. On any given night, we'll have 20, 25. And I have to literally push them out the door sometimes. We started at 6:30 in the evening, and, Father would like to get home by maybe 8:30, and I'm literally turning off the lights. But it's that experience of them being able to connect with one another, right? To put down the technology, to get out of their barracks room, and just have meaningful conversations, not just about faith, but just meaningful, true human connection with one another. It's amazing to watch how they flourish with that. But the military is a place for that. You're right. Father Joseph Anthony, it's a thing. The military does form amazing bonds, and that's been amazing for me too. Even with my non-Catholic chaplains, other service members, people in the military tend to desire that connection, I think, a bit more maybe than the general population.
All right, I have one last 2-part question.
Okay.
So maybe like a final thought, if you have one, something that you're hoping to express but haven't yet been asked to express. And the other thing is like a final encouragement. I'm thinking of like the theoretical 24-year-old dude who graduated top of his class from some good school and is working on Wall Street and making a bunch of money. He's practicing his Catholic faith, but like the magnanimous desires of his heart are not realized by an 85-hour work week. Like he wants to give of himself more. So final thought, and then a final encouragement to that guy, like might military chaplaincy be for him? Your thoughts?
It's possible. I think so. I think military, I would be a shameless plug here, but that would be, if you're looking for a way to serve Christ as a priest, whether that particularly as a diocesan or as part of a religious community, in which you have the opportunity to literally live, sleep, be with your people, then Navy chaplaincy is what it is. You have the unique opportunity to be with them, to take that energy, that drive, that excitement, maybe a little bit of a sense of adventure. We're moving every 2.5 to 3 years. I have literally ping-ponged around the globe from Okinawa, Japan, through back and forth, East Coast, West Coast. Then it might be the place where Christ could be calling you to serve his church, and particularly that 1% of our American population that has taken and responded and raised their right hand to serve.
Boom. and you might also get to blow stuff up. Oh, Father Joseph.
Yeah,
Anthony,
I got
follow up.
one more. There's a random question, but I feel like I have the opportunity, so I can't pass this up. Top Gun 1 or 2, which one's better?
Ooh, that's tough.
Yeah.
I think we have to go with the original, Top Gun 1, the original, absolutely. However, I can tell you, I was watching Top Gun 2 on Okinawa at a military base theater on an air station. There was definitely a unique vibe in the room as we're watching that happen. But I think one is never going to be surpassed.
Yeah, I think you got to watch them back to back too. Like watch 2 by itself and then go back and do a double feature because you just have to.
Definitely binge worthy.
Yes.
So the thing about 1 is that it was made in the 80s, which might be the best decade ever. But the thing about 2 is that it recaptures the spirit of the 80s, which for the nostalgic type in 2023 or whenever it was released is quite the feat. I saw it at a $6 theater in Berlin, Germany. Which is very different than a military base, as you might imagine. But still, the vibe was like a combination of consternation and euphoria. People were losing their minds. And mind you, these are Germans. So that's all to say. Thanks so much for joining us for this episode. We're super appreciative.
Thank you.
All right, turning to you, the listener, thanks so much for tuning into this episode of Godsplaining. Please follow us on the things where you follow us: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok. If you would like the episode, subscribe on YouTube or your podcast app and leave a 5-star review. All that helps to get the word out so that people might potentially listen and might potentially care and might potentially convert further. If you'd like to donate to the podcast through Patreon, you can follow the link in the description and or show notes. There you will also find links to shop merchandise and to get information for upcoming Godsplaining events. Something cool that's going to happen is we're doing a Day of Recollection in the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. And then we're doing a Day of Recollection in the Diocese of Columbus, Ohio. So you got information for both of those things at godsplaining.org. All right, that's all for us. No of our prayers for you. Please pray for us in turn, and we'll look forward to chatting with you next time on Godsplaining.